Hi everyone, welcome back for chapter 7. Today we're going to be talking about market structures or starting our unit on market structure. So we'll look at the 4 conditions that are in place in a perfectly competitive market, and then we'll talk about some common barriers that prevent firms from entering a market and selling their goods. And then we'll look at what prices and output look like in a perfectly competitive market. So perfect competition, I've used that term a couple times now in our learning targets for today. This is a market structure where a large number of firms all produce the same product and no single seller controls supply or prices. There's not many examples of perfectly competitive markets, but one market that is pretty close to perfectly competitive is the market for commodities. So a commodity is a product that is considered the same no matter who produces or who sells it. So most of our agricultural goods, wheat, corn, soybeans, etc., are going to be commodities. Oil, commodity. Okay. So it's the same, regardless of who makes it. Oh, barrier to entry is any factor that makes it difficult for a new firm to enter the market. That could include startup costs, which is another term on this slide. So these are the expenses that a new business must pay before it can begin to produce and sell goods. Oftentimes, startup costs include just like the cost of their machinery, so on and so forth. And then imperfect competition is just a market structure that fails to meet the conditions of perfect competition. So what are the characteristics of perfect competition? We're going to have lots of buyers and sellers. We're going to have identical products. We're going to have buyers and sellers that are informed and a relatively free entry and exit to the market. And we'll look a little bit at each of those characteristics in the coming slides here. So the simplest market structure is perfect competition. It is also sometimes called peer competition. So if you see that term, those two can be used interchangeably. And in perfect competition, we really have what would be considered for consumers the ideal market because there's so much competition, prices are low, there's a number of different firms that are selling the same product, so you have a choice on where to purchase those as a consumer. But in perfect competition, we also assume that the market is really in equilibrium. So we have like an equal amount of buyers and sellers, and basically all of the supply and demand graphs that we've been looking at up to this point are assuming perfect competition. Now, as I mentioned, there are only a few perfectly competitive markets in today's world because these markets have such strict conditions to meet, right? You need to have multiple buyers and sellers participating. You need to have identical products. And as I mentioned, relatively free entry and exit to the market, as well as buyers and sellers that are informed. So in perfect competition, no one person or firm can be so powerful as to influence the total market quantity or market price. So this is the exact opposite of a monopoly, which we're going to talk about as another type of market structure. So we need to have lots of buyers and sellers to make sure that the marketplace is perfectly competitive. We also need to have identical products, so there needs to be literally no difference in the products that are sold. So you think about maybe the market for like fitness trackers, right? So I have a Fitbit, but there's Garmin's and there's all these different types, right? Amazon just came out with one. but they're all a little bit different. And they all have their unique characteristics. That's not perfect competition because the products aren't identical. Here, the market for sugar is really perfectly competitive because it's the same product, regardless of what brand you buy. So we're gonna only really see perfect competition in the commodity market. So that would include sugar, as noted here, low-grade gasoline, no, like loose leaf notebook paper, wheat, right? All of those things would be likely to be perfectly competitive. We also need informed buyers and sellers. So under the conditions of perfect competition, the market is going to provide the buyer with the full information about the product features and its price. And both buyers and sellers are going to have full disclosure about that product. So it really is a market structure that is most beneficial for consumers because there's so much competition, and we also know, like, are we getting a good product or not? And then we need free market entry and exit. So it needs to be very easy for sellers to enter and exit the market. Usually they are going to enter the market when the product is very popular and exit the market when the demand for that product decreases. So this means we have to have really, really low or almost non-existent startup costs. So as we're going through these different sections in chapter 7, I'm going to have you guys record kind of these 4 criteria because we're going to talk about each of these criteria as we go through the other market structures as well. So that'll kind of help us differentiate between the different market structures. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in class, but these are kind of the 4 things we're going to look at as we go through each of the market structures. So in perfect competition, we have many firms, no variety of goods, no barriers to entry, and that results in really no control over price. So common barriers to entry include startup costs, which was a vocab word for us. So when startup costs are high, it's more difficult for new firms to enter the market. So markets that have super high startup costs like tech are less likely to be perfectly competitive. And then the second startup cost would be technology. So that makes the tech industry even more difficult to get into because there are markets that require a high degree of technical knowledge, and that can make it really difficult to enter without preparation and study. So the barrier to entry that can be overcome by education or vocational training would be that technology piece. Can I get the technical knowledge from a vocational program or from education so that it's easier for me to enter the market when demand for a product is high? So for example here, like a landscaping business is going to have almost no like technical challenges. Most people can learn fairly quickly on the job. Startup costs are really low if you're just using like hand tools. However, an auto repair shop is going to require more advanced technical knowledge, and the equipment needed to run the shop creates higher startup costs, and that is a more significant barrier to entry. So perfectly competitive markets are efficient, and competition keeps both prices and production costs low. In a perfectly competitive market, prices correctly represent the opportunity cost of every product. So in other words, you're paying a fair price. It seems like a fair trade-off, right? In perfect competition, we are going to see the lowest sustainable prices possible. In other words, what price can we sell at that's really fair for consumers, but also keeps our suppliers in business and keeps them profitable. So we talked about a bag of sugar. It's going to be like $1 at the grocery store, right? That's a really low price, and it does happen to be a sustainable price for that commodity market as well. So how are output decisions made in perfect competition? Since no supplier in a perfectly competitive market can influence price, producers will make their output decisions just based on how do we use our resources most efficiently. So the answer for this is based on a producer's most efficient use of resources. All right, that's 7.1. Let me know if you have questions. Have a great rest of your day.